So today we are going to learn a little bit about Geoffrey Chaucer and the frame story. We talked in the last lesson about the evolution of English from Old English to Middle English, and Geoffrey Chaucer was the most important writer of the Middle English period in English literature. In fact, Geoffrey Chaucer is known as the father of English literature. And the reason for that has to do with what we discussed in terms of when the French came over and defeated England in the Battle of Hastings. The French people became the lords and the nobles of the land. And so the king spoke French, all the nobles spoke French, and it was only the lower class peasants who still spoke English. They spoke Latin in the church. And so that's why down here it says French and Latin were dominant across Europe. French was the language of the aristocracy. Latin was the language of the church. And English then was just the language of the peasants. So all legitimate literature, all respected literature and stories were written in French or Latin. Those were the smart people languages, so to speak. I hope you can hear my air quotes when I say that. They were the respected languages. And English was kind of considered coarse and unintelligent, really. I mean, I can't really think of another word for it. English was just considered the low-class language. And so it was frowned upon. It was looked down upon as being not as beautiful as French and Latin. Geoffrey Chaucer set out to change that. And when he published his work that we're going to talk about here in a minute in English, it proved to the literary community, it proved to the French aristocracy even, that English could be a beautiful literary language. And for that, we call him the father of English literature. So a little bit of background about Chaucer first. He was born in 1340 AD. His parents were affluent, which means wealthy. They were wealthy and they were in the wine trade. Chaucer did not want to follow in his family's footsteps, though, and he became an ambassador, a public servant. And he was an ambassador to France and some other places. He was a diplomat, and so he traveled at the service of the royal family. And so he was a well-to-do citizen of England. He had money and privileges, and there is a famous story about how the King of England paid a very heavy ransom to get Chaucer back from France because he had been kidnapped and held hostage, basically, as an ambassador. All the while that he was being basically a government civil servant, he was writing, and he wrote many different pieces. And that is actually what he is well known for now. So even though he worked really hard as a civil servant all his life, he is remembered and honored for the work that he was writing in his spare time. And the most famous of those was the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is a collection of 24 stories that are told by various pilgrims as they travel across the countryside to visit the shrine of a Christian saint. The Canterbury Tales, they're called that because they were on their way to Canterbury. So these pilgrims that are on their way to Canterbury, first let me explain what a pilgrim is. We think of pilgrims as like those people in the black hats and the buckle shoes from Thanksgiving. The reason we call them pilgrims is because they came to America on a religious journey. They came here for a religious reason. And so they were religious travelers. That's basically what a pilgrim is. And a pilgrimage is specifically a journey taken to visit the shrine of a saint or taken for religious purposes. And so all these people in this picture here are on a pilgrimage. They are traveling to this shrine for religious reasons. As you can see, though, they're having a pretty good time, and we'll talk about what they're doing to pass the time. Another reason that the Canterbury Tales is so important is because the pilgrims come from many different social classes. So if you think about that feudal pyramid that was in our last lesson, there are members of each of those social classes except for the king. The prioress is a member of the church, and there are several members of the church there. The wife of Bath is rather wealthy. There is a knight that is on the journey. There are also people who are pretty lower class. The summoner, the clerk, they don't have a lot of money. And the shipmen, they're laborers. So some people will study the Canterbury Tales in order to look at that feudal pyramid and what society really was like in the Middle Ages, because Chaucer was writing this during the Middle Ages. He wasn't looking back into the past. He was writing about his time period. And that makes it historically and socially important, as well as an important piece of literature. So the Canterbury Tales begins as this group of pilgrims are gathered together at a hotel to prepare for their long journey. And we are about to read that piece where they do that. The owner of the hotel, who is called the host, has an idea. He says, "Oh, you people are so friendly and so wonderful. How about we all travel together and we can tell each other stories to pass the time?" I'm not sure what you wrote about in your road trip journal, but storytelling is a good way to pass the time when you're hanging out with friends. So he says, we'll each take turns telling stories. And to sweeten the deal, I'll offer a prize. Since the host is the owner of a hotel, he says, I'll be the judge, and whoever I determine told the best story will get a free meal and a free room at the inn when we return from Canterbury. Pretty good prize. And everyone agrees. So we're skipping quite ahead here. There are supposed to be 29 stories in the Canterbury Tales. There are only, as it told you in the previous slide, wrong way. There are only 24 stories mentioned. So he died before he could finish it. There are only 24 stories. There were 29 pilgrims. He died before he could really finish the Canterbury Tales. But that is still a lot of very rich and entertaining stories, and they're all very different from each other. Look at this beautiful church. Chaucer was buried here at Westminster Abbey, which is where they bury princes and kings and people who have been of great service to England. It shows that he was an honored citizen in his lifetime. So before we move on to read the story, we have one more thing we need to talk about, and that is the frame story. The Canterbury Tales is a frame story. And the whole idea of a frame story is that there is an external narrative, there is an outside story that is used to hold all the other stories together. And so in the Canterbury Tales, the outer frame that's holding this whole thing together is this group of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury, and they're telling each other stories. The inner frame then is made up of lots of different stories and lots of different pictures. You can picture this more like a collage when it comes to the Canterbury Tales, because each of the stories told by the pilgrims are very different. And so they don't even really belong in the same book, except that this outer frame holds them together. So this image is pretty appropriate. It's got a lot of stories inside other stories. There are a lot. This is a very popular narrative technique. If you're familiar with the film Forrest Gump is a frame story. Really, throughout the whole movie, Forrest Gump is just sitting on that bus bench waiting for the bus to come, and he's telling the people who sit down next to him stories about his life. And so then the movie flashes back to show you all the different things that Forrest Gump has done in his life. But the whole time he's sitting on that bench telling stories. So that's a really good example of a frame story if you're familiar with that movie.